the local government has always been important for the ANC as an important sphere of government. As you know, negotiations in South Africa produced the 3 tiers of government. And if you looked at them, you'll realize that the bulk of our people are found in the municipalities. But South Africa is not at the same level in terms of development. And therefore, in terms of many other things. Generally in the world, development tends to focus on urban areas. Rural areas are, in a sense, made to benefit from the urban areas. In other countries, the kind of development, much as these areas will look different, but there would be moments where people would go to the rural areas, nicely develop, and even if the differences are there, but they will not be so sharp and acute. What in South Africa people don't realize is the fact that we ran a system that was never run in any other country in the world, called apartheid. Other was institutionalized racism. That then created an abnormal situation in South Africa, that rural areas were not just left behind in terms of the urban areas, like the normal thing that I'm talking of. Here it was abnormal. People in rural areas were not allowed in big numbers to come to urban areas. And yet, if you compare with other countries, there was never any prohibition of people to look for opportunities and also use what they get here to develop the rural areas. It's an important point to look at, because people, for an example, who criticize government tend to identify in their own way the causes in a wrong way. Even economic analysts, if they talk about South Africa, they group South Africa to a certain level of middle countries. And they leave it there without saying something more with regard to South Africa. That whatever country you compare South Africa, never experienced what South Africa experienced, the institutionalized racism. This had a lot of things, including, among others, to deprive the people from rural areas education and opportunities. Deprive them of benefiting from urban areas in terms of development, etc. So, if you don't appreciate that, you not understand why today South Africa, 20 years, must take a very specific approach to municipalities. Because much as we have provided the level of government, but we are faced with a situation where in other countries, as I've said, in rural areas there will be tarred roads, there will be many things. We are talking about areas that was totally neglected. So in the 20 years where we come from, we have worked hard to ensure that we bring development and changing the quality of lives from one corner to the other. But the experience of 20 years, and people will remember that during the time of campaigning, I said a lot about 20 years of governance that we have. It has become very clear that if you do not pay attention to rural areas, you are not in fact addressing one of the core corners of apartheid. That is why 2009, instead of talking about the rural development, we established a department to deal with this matter. In no country, in the countries that are compared to South Africa, will say we need to focus on the rural areas, because those matters have been focused before. And therefore, we realized that whatever we do, the rural areas are remaining behind. There are many things we could talk about. Let us talk about, for an example, practical thing like electricity or energy. People before 1994, millions of South Africans were outside. They were not provided electricity because that was not their right. They did not deserve it, according to this apartheid government I'm talking about. If there was a white farmer who decided to farm somewhere in the rural areas, government of apartheid, who practice the institutionalized racism, they will take the lines from whatever power station and take it to the home of that farmer, so that that farmer there will have electricity to do everything. This line will be walking across millions. Nobody thought they needed to find it. To be given that. Now, come freedom. We say, let us fulfill the rights of the South African citizens who are in rural areas, roll out electricity. What happens? The electricity was, in the past until 1994, said was in abundance in South Africa. In fact, some people argued that it was one of the things that attracted investors, because it was there cheaper and people would come and buy it. Suddenly, which exposes this institutionalized apartheid policy. Immediately we did so. We discovered that, in fact, electricity was short in the country, as it is still a problem. It's an example that we need to appreciate. And therefore, people in rural areas who are now aware that they've got a right to electricity, they demand electricity. People say this government is failing to deliver. What do you deliver if there's nothing there? If you walk into a house which is empty, by the fact that you sit in that house and you blame the person who's just walked in, because people who were there before did not stock the house. It's a serious matter with regards to these rural areas. And I'm making the example of electricity because it has interesting stories. Somebody in the rural areas, when you hear somebody coming from the urban areas today because of the electricity problem, will say, hey, we're in trouble. The load shedding has come. And they say, what are you talking about? In the rural areas. They don't know what is load shedding, because they don't have electricity. In other words, if you took another thing, not just that one, many other things, if you take informal settlements today in South Africa, that again, people will say government is not delivering on the housing. We've built houses in this country that very few countries would say within 20 years they did. in every part of South Africa. But the demand remains high. Why? It is because the apartheid government, that we know it was governing this country before, had laws that prevented people from coming from rural areas and brought a situation that people there would stay where there were no opportunities. Now, as soon as apartheid laws go away, they flood the cities, the urban areas, looking for opportunities. Urban areas, the way they are built, infrastructure was not accommodating those kind of people. So what they do, they can't sleep on the streets, so they pitch up tents and informal settlement. And this is a problem today, which is a problem of apartheid. But people wanted to say this problem is because the government is failing to deliver. Is failing to get rid of informal settlements. If you don't understand this background, you would in fact even agree with the people who are wrong. Because the reality is, only now that these people have rights to houses. Now, I'm making these two examples because they are critical things to our lives. You then come back and say, here we are, establish the local government. Local government has no resources. Has no resources. The small little towns where people used to go and buy had very little. So you end up with a problem of a distorted social life in a South Africa that today can be equated to other countries. That's what I'm saying. Is actually, we can equate it. After equating it, then qualify South Africa, among others. Somebody was saying not long time ago, why would countries in the region grow in terms of their economy with 2 digits? Why South Africa? And I'm saying, if you shy away from looking at the facts as they are, you would actually think the government is failing. And if you could just go around and look at the period of 20 years this country is being free, we are in the region, and ANC, what delivery ANC made, you will discover we actually made the delivery that at times is 100-fold above the other countries. Now, it is because of the South African peculiarity that you are therefore going to say you cannot leave the municipalities, some of which have no basis at all to develop, no revenue, who actually are living on grants. And if you were to sit and do nothing, you'll realize that you have a problem. Because the people out there will then say this government is not delivering. What is it? Now, this abnormality brings about, even in the urban areas, a situation, because it must impact on the urban areas. As a government, therefore, as a government, looking as we did, you remember that in 2009, for an example, we took a clear decision that we are going to roll out in massive infrastructure. As you do the infrastructure itself, you come across this problem that, in fact, if you do not focus on the municipalities, you could spend another 20 years having not made much change. Therefore, as the government of the people of this country, we have taken a very deliberate decision that we must focus on the municipalities so that we bring the level of development higher. Now, the reason why I talked about 2009 establishing a Department of Rural Development, clearly, if you were to allow that department on its own, without the focus of government, it's going to take a long time. They have created such opportunities and made such areas to develop to a certain degree, but you can't see it. Many commentators who sit in urban areas who were never even in the rural areas don't even know what's happened. The critical point, government is there to ensure that it deals with the country, the development of the country, the well-being, everything. So we are now saying of the 3 levels of government, we are paying special attention to the 3rd one, because it is the government structure that will develop the rural areas through municipalities. And that's the reason why we have taken it as one of the priorities, because it must impact on these millions who live there to change their lives.